Welcome to This Week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. It's post-Labor Day, which in American politics means it's a sprint to the election box on Election Day, November 5th. We're going to set the scene for you with some of our favorite people, including Meg Kennard with the Associated Press, South Carolina Public Radio reporter Mayan Schechter, and communications consultant Rob Godfrey. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for
having us.
Welcome to the sprint. Meg, you and I have been on the campaign trail for I don't know how many months,
Forever.
how many years, yes. I remember back when there were actually 9 major Republican candidates in this race, including 2 South Carolinians. We are now down to former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris, ever since that decision by Joe Biden in late July to jump out of the race. We are now less than 55 days away from Election Day, November 5th. So set the scene first in terms of where this race stands right now. It's been a wild couple weeks. Where are we in this race?
It has been a wild couple weeks, and every time I talk with colleagues about what's happened this summer, which is usually like, oh, this is going to be a little bit slower maybe for the campaign. Not this
Absolutely
summer.
not.
We've gone from an assassination attempt to a fruit basket turnover basically at the top of the Democratic ticket, and now we're in this post-Labor Day moment where voters across the country are really starting to tune in. It's like a broken record. We talk about it all the time, but this is the moment when the greater voting populace is saying, okay, what are my options? Where am I making these decisions? And I know we're going to talk about it in a little bit, but really it is the focus on these swing states, these pivotal places where the margins are anticipated to be close, where they've historically been close in recent elections. The focus and the level of attention on those voters in particular is probably the most intense that I've ever seen. And it's not that, we out in the other states are forgotten about necessarily. Clearly, our votes are just as important, but maybe not as pivotal in terms of coming down to, the rubber meeting the road between those 2 major party candidates. And so we're going to be seeing a lot more travel at the top of the ticket in terms of going to those places, but also really just seeing more ads, more influx of travel and just all of the overall messaging, surrogate travel. It's really going to start to get intense, and we've got 50 some odd days to go.
Exactly.
So there's still plenty of time.
And Meg, just to piggyback on what you're saying, the travel, the attention, all this nonstop coverage, it's not the media. You're a national politics reporter for the Associated Press. It's not the media driving this, right? I mean, a lot of people were saying, oh my gosh, Kamala Harris had all this momentum. The media was spinning it up. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, when news dictates, we cover the news, and that's what happens.
That's right. We cover, especially for the AP, we cover whatever is the top national news at the time, which how could you not say that replacing one top of the ticket nominee with another would be the top national story. But yes, this was a major moment for not just the Democratic Party, but also for all across the political spectrum, just trying to figure out what is this major matchup that's going to be happening in the general presidential election. And so it was on us in the media to cover that in real time from the moment that Joe Biden ended his reelection bid to the groundswell of support among Democrats to propel Kamala Harris to that nomination. That was clearly something that we all had to cover each step of the way, but it was the Democratic Party that set those processes in motion, and we were just following along and informing voters because those choices clearly are going to matter to them.
Yeah, we had a bit of a wild summer there.
Oh, yeah.
We were out at conventions, of course, but Meg, I'm going to keep with you for a moment here and talk about the debate on Tuesday night. You were following from the AP's Washington Bureau. Who needed to do what on the historic debate stage in Philadelphia? What did we see play out there between these 2 nominees?
This was definitely a really moment of intense, honed focus on Donald Trump and for Kamala Harris. She hadn't been on a debate stage. Clearly, the first debate that happened in the general election cycle was with Joe Biden, and we all know how that went, and that's kind of how we ended up here. But so for her, yes, she's been vice president, but this was an opportunity for her to be introducing herself as major party nominee to voters who have kind of been aware of what's happening, certainly, but haven't heard directly from her. She hasn't done a whole lot of media interviews, something the Republicans talk about a lot, but this was, 90 plus minutes of her making her case. And for Donald Trump, it was to observe those interactions between him and Harris. We hadn't seen that happen ever. They hadn't even met until Tuesday night, certainly not debated. And so it was an opportunity for voters to really be seeing, okay, we might be familiar with some of his positions, but how is he going to be facing off with this candidate? How is he going to be facing off with another female nominee, which clearly there was a lot of conversation in 2016 back when that happened with Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump. So there were a lot of dividing lines and moments of contrast, but also on the issues. I don't think a lot of minds are probably changed in that issue debate, But it was really for me observing those political and stylistic differences.
Yeah, that personality versus policy, which is dominating politics, of course.
Right.
Maayan, you were watching the debate. You were covering the debate here in Columbia with a bunch of Democrats watching that as well. What were the takeaways from folks there? What were some of the big reactionary moments that you saw play out in Columbia?
This was obviously a very pro-Harris crowd, judging by the number of screams and hand clapping and then talking while Donald Trump was talking on the debate stage. But there was some diversity in opinion about how she carried herself. For example, I talked to one person who felt like the mics really should have been turned on, while someone else said no, her facial expressions did what the mics could never do. I asked voters their thoughts on what was her strongest moment, weakest moment. Strongest was her answer on abortion care access. And I saw that with my own eyes when she answered the question. The entire audience, dozens of people, jumped up and screamed and clapped. So it was very evident that that was probably her strongest moment of the night. And thankfully for probably all these voters who are watching, that came in the first hour, because by the second hour, people were starting to filter out. That was her strongest moment. I also talked to another voter who said they felt like her strongest moment was talking about former President Donald Trump's relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin. They felt like that was good. Her weakest moment, talking about the border, felt like that could have been better. And then also they felt like she didn't articulate her policies well enough. But then I talked to another voter who said, oh, it was incredibly refreshing to hear her talk about policies for the first time really on the campaign trail. I would say the overall takeaway, though, was that this is an excited crowd.
Yeah.
Everyone talked about the last presidential debate and what that could have looked like this round. The momentum is there. So even if people didn't love Kamala Harris, even if people didn't love Donald Trump, they felt like Kamala Harris was still the stronger candidate on that debate stage and is the candidate to really carry the party moving forward.
Yeah, I was up in Greenville with about 200 Republicans at a watch party up there, so completely different dynamic there
Very.
too. A lot of people doing the same things too, clapping at some of the big moments there from Trump. Also, talking over Harris, even during that abortion response. It was kind of surprising. A lot of people were kind of grumbling about her response there, even though that is such a huge issue for so many voters in this race since we're in this post-Roe era. But it was also interesting, too, because there is divisiveness within the Republican Party in South Carolina, but they are definitely still unified under Donald Trump, in so many ways. But I was surprised when I talked to a number of folks, the Republicans, who were saying that she actually did a good job. They were actually surprised by the job that she did. Rob, you were watching that. Obviously, that's not going to change minds in that crowd, but when you're looking at independents and moderate Republicans, maybe she did get some folks to come over, or at least listen to her case versus Donald Trump.
I thought it was a tale of two debates in some ways. The first 25 minutes, I thought the former president did pretty well. The first question, I think he did well talking about the economy under his presidency. And I thought the vice president's answer wasn't quite as strong as her answers were on other issues as the debate progressed. But that was a moment, and then there were other takeaway moments as the debate started to unfold. I think one of the most heartening moments for the entire evening was when both candidates shook hands for the first time. We saw presidential candidates shake hands in a number of years. That's something that we need to get back to. I think everybody can agree to. So when they embraced and shook hands, I thought that set a good tone for the night. Although, when we go back to the much disputed issue of whether mics should have been muted, I don't think that ended up making much of a difference because they both had great back and forth throughout the entire evening, regardless of whether the mics were on. I think moments that that people are going to remember from the debate. After that first 25 minutes that the former president was able to find his footing talking about his record and talking about the economy was the kind of turning point where crowd size became an issue and it clearly got under his skin. And by the time crowd size was litigated, we'd turned into talking about, some much more controversial issues and memorable issues such as people's pets and stuff like that.
Statements that were debunked, yes.
Yes, no question. And so I thought overall, when it comes to independents and when it comes to swing voters, I think that Vice President Harris had a very strong night. I think that they were she was able to reintroduce herself to many of them. I think that she was able to do that on her terms. She has a strong background as a prosecutor, someone who has obviously met the moment in a courtroom, met the moment, in a long career in public service. And so I think she did herself as much of a favor as she could, but conceding that this is a polarized country, a polarized electorate, and I don't know that there were many hearts and minds to win over for either candidate.
When I think a lot of folks were saying the expectations were low for her, but at the same time they were pretty high because every little thing would have been scrutinized more so than maybe some of his 33 or so mistruths, misstatements. But Rob, you're a comms guy. You have been in those debate prep rooms with our current governor, with the previous governor. You kind of gave us a good overview there in terms of how they did. But when it comes to debates, I mean, how much do they really matter? We saw that some 67 million people did tune into this debate.
Sure. Well, we saw obviously the first presidential debate mattered a lot. It was one of the most consequential presidential debates in history because it essentially ended the candidacy of the sitting president. And it did so because so many people had eyes on it. When we talk about whether debates matter, I think we're in a shifting period of whether debates matter because not just do 67 million people watch it on debate night, but people watch clips of it over and over again on social media, every platform from X to Facebook to TikTok to Reels on Instagram. And so there are these viral moments that each of these candidates take away. They don't just take their campaigns don't just take them away, but they shoot for them. I mean, and an issue like abortion, which is a strong one for Vice President Harris, what she has said, we've seen video footage of it over and over again on social media, just like we have with the former president and his riff on what's happening allegedly to people's pets. But also, for the former president, also what he talked about on the economy. So I think debates do matter on the national stage. Debates are going to matter more and more as people put more and more stock into what the digital impact of these things are. Not just traditional television, which also matters too.
And it's not just those viral clips of video. I mean, I went to bed at an embarrassingly late hour after the debate because I had a lot of work to do and it's hard to wind down, but it's just scrolling through my Instagram feed. All I saw, and this isn't just because it's like the accounts I follow, it's like things that were just being promoted, memes and pictures and facial expressions and that split screen, that is, it seems kind of maybe funny in the moment, but that is exactly what Rob's talking about, the kind of thing that's going to be resonating and recirculating. And if we don't have another debate, that's all we're going to know from debates between Harris and Trump. And, there are a lot of young voters who might be interested to keep watching that.
And that's that entryway into covering, into understanding politics.
Debate night is when rapid response teams are at their peaks. And so the rapid response teams for both of these campaigns got clips out that will live online forever.
Rob, I want to move a little bit more and talk about your previous boss, Nikki Haley. You're her comms director there. She's still very visible after ending her campaign, her presidential bid there. She spoke in primetime at the Republican National Convention. She has a new high-profile gig. She is traveling the world. She was just recently in Taiwan. She just sat down with Face the Nation's Margaret Brennan over the weekend. And she mentioned that she has not been deployed by the Trump campaign to go and campaign on his behalf. Is that a mistake by the Trump campaign not to use Nikki Haley?
You'd have to ask the Trump campaign what their calculus is there. Obviously, Governor Haley is a tremendously effective surrogate wherever she goes. When she takes on an issue or takes up a fight, we've seen that for years. But what we also have to concede is that she and former President Trump had a particularly tough primary, and she made some arguments about his fitness for office that may be tough to square if you get back on the campaign trail and campaign for him, because there are going to be reporters covering those events that she does and asking her questions about how she squares those things. I know that she's done that when she's made these appearances on Face the Nation, but the question is, what swath of voters are you trying to win over, and does she actually win those voters over? And who were those Haley voters by the end of the campaign who were running up some of those margins against Donald Trump? And if those were voters who were simply casting protest votes, their minds are already made up. So I think it's an open question about whether it would be an effective strategy.
She also, just one thing to piggyback on that, she also said repeatedly during the Republican primary campaign that America is either going to end up with a President Nikki Haley or President Kamala Harris.
Call it.
She said it over and over and over, and clearly Nikki Haley is out of the campaign. Kamala Harris is at the top of the Democratic ticket. That doesn't necessarily, if you follow that argument along, mean a huge support for Donald Trump in that head-to-head matchup. So the Trump campaign is probably also remembering that too.
And speaking of viral videos, I'm sure that's a viral video that would follow her to each of those events, thanks to the Kamala Harris social media
Yeah.
effort.
And I was going to say, also, it's probably saving her some face with her supporters because she is still getting blowback for endorsing him. But Meg, you've traveled a good bit with Senator J.D. Vance, Ohio Senator there, who's the running mate for President Trump, former president. Is Vance helping or hurting the ticket from what we've seen so far, especially when you look at, who could have been on that ticket, and possibly Tim Scott, maybe Nikki Haley, but that was always doubtful in my opinion. But then you look at these big moments, you get the big endorsement by Taylor Swift for Kamala Harris, holding her cat in her Instagram post. They're referencing the childless cat ladies that J.D. Vance has spoken about. Then you also have Vance amplifying that false story about Haitian immigrants in Ohio, his state. Is he helping or hurting at this point based on these things and others?
J.D. Vance was definitely promoted for this job of running mate by a lot of people, including Donald Trump Jr. And one of the things that he liked about J.D. Vance was his ability to make those kind of spicy arguments and to bring up topics that maybe Donald Trump necessarily isn't going to be talking about, although we did hear him talk about Springfield, Ohio, and a lot of the same things that Vance has been echoing there. But they liked him because he is that kind of forceful sort of, I don't really care what the reaction is, I'm just going to go out and say it. And when I've been along the campaign trail and talking to voters and seeing reaction to him, there's a lot of support, but it is kind of, I often wonder, what if we were in a situation where there were someone who was more to the moderate end of the conservative spectrum, like some of those other people that you just mentioned, would that kind of balance out the Republican ticket? Because that's definitely not what's happening with J.D. Vance as part of it. It's, he does consider himself to be a relatively new Republican, all things considered. He wasn't a backer of Donald Trump when Donald Trump first ran for president, and he's talked about that and says he's explained it. But he is now very much in line with a lot of the topics and policy positions that Donald Trump has adopted as he's evolved from candidate to president, now to candidate again. And I haven't really heard from a lot of people who would be in that persuadable middle of voters who are like, yeah, J.D. Vance does it for me. That's why I now consider myself to be a Donald Trump voter in this fall's election. We got plenty of runway left, but I'm not exactly sure if anybody who wasn't already decided that they were going to be supporting Donald Trump is won over by J.D. Vance now being on that ticket.
And then when we look at that Taylor Swift endorsement, that came out Tuesday night right after the debate. How big is that for the Harris campaign?
They're certainly very happy about it. And it was a big moment that came when there were a lot of eyeballs among political watchers. Anybody who'd stayed up for that debate, all of a sudden when that Instagram post hit, they were still up and paying attention. But again, I don't know, similar to what I was just saying, I don't know how many people are persuaded by that. I mean, clearly Taylor Swift is one of the biggest pop stars and celebrities on the planet right now. I think she has more than 250 million followers on Instagram, which that's just a number, but it's a really big number. Yeah. But again, it's something great for the Harris campaign, as Rob was saying, to be putting out in social media, to be talking about and saying like, oh, look at the support that we are building. But in terms of persuadable voters, I'm not exactly sure what it gets them, but it is a pretty cool thing for them to be able to be out there talking about in the next 2 months or so.
Yeah, and we've seen those voter registration numbers jump too.
Absolutely, and that's real, and that's a metric that anybody would be proud of. I would hope, just bringing in new voters and people who are interested in politics, wherever they end up landing on November 5th. I mean, that's at least a good thing to say about what's happening.
To talk about both running mates, both Senator Vance and Governor Walz, it seems like a little bit of the excitement has kind of stalled for both of them. Governor Walz was, doing rallies with Vice President Harris that first week, those first 2 or 3 weeks now. This thing's gone so fast. And we haven't seen him do as much of the solo surrogate work as we've seen Senator Vance do. And that's one of the things I think they chose Senator Vance to be able to do, because he has strong TV skills. He is able to get out there and do more of the TV interviews than President Trump can do, wants to do, or anything like that. And he's able to bracket the other side in a way that perhaps President Trump isn't able to. And he's able to do it in a very disciplined way. And plus, he's a younger, fresher face. And so I think that, both Senator Vance and Governor Walz have some more potential to lead a surrogate charge for both candidates, and we'll have to see if they more aggressively do that over the course of the next few weeks.
Yeah, especially when we look at those swing states, which of course South Carolina is not. We have North Carolina and we have Georgia below us, but right here in South Carolina, we're nice Republican stronghold, which Republicans enjoy, they maintain. But that being said, Maayan, when we look at down ballot races here, we're talking about Congress, we're talking about 124 state House seats, we're also talking about 46 state Senate seats that are for re-election. A lot of those races have already kind of been decided based on the June primaries. But is there anything that is going to shift coming November 5th when it comes to how we see the presidential ticket play out down here on these smaller races?
This is obviously the topic that I'm most interested in because I look back, as y'all will recall, in 2020 when Democrats lost 5 seats in the House and the Senate when Donald Trump was at the top of the ticket. And as you both know, as you all three know, most voters hit that, party button when they go vote and they leave the voting booth. In 2020, Democrats lost 2 seats in the House and a whopping 3 seats in the Senate, which was huge. And all 3 of those senators had been in the upper chamber for a long period of time, including a 2-time Democratic nominee for governor. Now we are in a post-redistricting phase, especially when it comes to the Senate. Like you mentioned, the June primaries, we already are seeing the legislature tilt a bit more conservative. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the House. There are some seats that Democrats feel like they should, of course, have won back in 2022 that they're hoping to win. Republicans already have a supermajority. But the Senate, to me, is really where the story is. Drew McKissick, chairman of the state Republican Party. We've heard Shane Massey, the majority leader in the Senate for Republicans, talk about how they feel like they have the momentum to flip even more seats in the Senate, which is huge for Republicans. And there are definitely some rural Democrats who are at risk, especially because of these district lines changing so significantly. So yes, even though we are have a Republican controlled legislature already, the reality is that this legislature is likely to tilt more conservative, but get even more red because of what is occurring. So we'll see. Democrats right now are putting up a very big fight, and I think especially with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, they feel a lot better in some of those maybe purple-ish areas in the state. But still, I mean, at the end of the day, it's who shows up with those 2 weeks of early voting, and then of course on election day.
Yeah, like we said, we already saw a lot of that play out in the primaries with 3 Republican sister senators actually getting knocked off there too, so being replaced with more conservative folks. And then you look over in the House and you've seen some folks who were part of the House Freedom Caucus who maybe ran for Congress or had other issues have been knocked out too, so there'll be a reshuffling there too. So it will be interesting to see how the State House looks come January. Rob, any takeaways there when we talk about down ballot races here?
I think Maayan was exactly right. I think we shouldn't underestimate the fundraising prowess of Speaker Smith, of Senator Massey, and of Chairman McKissick. The 3 of them have done well, particularly the legislative leaders, to put their members in position to do exactly what they need to do in the general election to potentially expand the majorities in both houses. And we haven't seen that down ballot momentum for Democrats really since 2008. And so while I absolutely have seen the enthusiasm gap for Democrats be closed, we didn't see that enthusiasm when President Biden was at the top of the ticket. It's going to be a really tall task for Democratic candidates to make a lot of headway, against some really well-funded Republican State House candidates.
And a lot of that major money that's being raised by the Harris campaign is going towards more at-risk states, at-risk districts. South Carolina doesn't really have that, especially now that we're in this post-redistricting era too. But Rob, really quick, anything that you're watching leading up to Election Day that we should be watching for when it comes to the presidential campaign?
Whether as far as South Carolina goes, or
nationally, I should say.
Nationally, I mean, look, we've got two swing states that are incredibly important right on our border, and their media markets spill into our state, particularly North Carolina, in the upstate and in the Charlotte market. We're going to see a lot of all 4 people on the tickets in North Carolina, and that Charlotte market is and we're going to see their television. We're going to see their television ads. We're going to see their messages. We're going to see what matters. And so I think we can be on the lookout for that. It'll provide some excitement. It'll provide some excitement for some of those races up in the the York County area. It'll also provide some excitement for reporters who are able to go over and cover that stuff. And I think we'll do that. And what we'll also see, given the fact that this is an early primary state, is who from South Carolina could potentially serve in a Trump administration, should there be another Trump administration, and who in South Carolina could potentially serve in a Harris administration. We forget about that, but we play an incredibly important role on both sides. When it comes to presidential politics, and that puts our state at a disproportionately high number of people who are serving in that West Wing.
And how we never stop here. Meg, 30 seconds, what you're watching here.
A lot of those things that Rob was just talking about, but honestly, I mean, for me, I'm going to be spending a lot of time in those swing states that we're talking about, in the Sun Belt states, but also the Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. So those are the places where the rubber really meets the road. As we were talking about, the numbers there are really tight. They're probably going to be getting tighter and tighter. And, that's interesting for those of us who observe politics, not as much in South Carolina, because as you just noted, we're pretty solidly in that red column in the Republican sense. But it is going to be, I think, we always say it's a pivotal election, but I think this one's going to be really close. And so I'll be watching for the margins in those states, not just those national polls that come out, but really in the states,
and those
since that's where
polls
the votes
are so tight. They are even tighter after that debate, so we'll be watching a lot of things with less than 60 days to go. It's Meg Kennard with the Associated Press, Maayan Schechter with the South Carolina Public Radio, and Rob Godfrey, our communications consultant here on set. Thank you all for watching. For South Carolina ETV, I'm Gavin Jackson. Be well, South Carolina.